So let us go ahead and get started with this office hours on the microbiome and aging. And thanks so much for being with me today for this one. It's a really interesting topic because, we're all, I think, in some ways looking for that fountain of youth, right? What can we do to not just look more youthful, but to feel more youthful and to, as much as we can, sort of slow that process of aging. But I remind people all the time that the alternative to aging is not being here, which is not a great alternative. Let me just turn up the volume here. Actually, let me start over because my volume is all the way down. Welcome to this office hours edition of the Microbiome and Aging. And for those of you who might be feeling a little depressed about the prospect of aging, let me remind you that the alternative to aging, to not aging, is not being here. So that's one way to stop aging, right? Is to stop living. So we need to embrace aging and be grateful that we're here. And hopefully we're getting not just older, but wiser. But here's the thing. There's a really strong connection between how we age. We're all going to age, but how we age and what's going on in our gut. So again, one of those examples where what's inside really counts. So if I can just recap what happens as we age, really starting with birth with our microbiome. The first 3 years, for those of you who've heard me talk about the microbiome before, and if you're interested, go back and look at office hours on the microbiome. But from birth to about age 3, so roughly around the first 1,000 days of our lives are super critical because this is when our microbiome is really burgeoning and blossoming and becoming populated with these founding species. And I've spoken before about the difference between vaginal birth and a C-section birth and the differences in the microbiome and nursing, etc. So I assume that nobody on this call is between birth and 3 years old. So we're all in a more advanced stage of aging. So those first 3 years, things are changing very, very rapidly. And the baby's microbiome is starting to look less like the maternal microbiome and more like external microbiome and other people's microbiomes, okay? And then between age 3 and 18, there's still a lot of development to the microbiome, and it is still very tender, is how I like to put it, in terms of susceptibility to perturbations like antibiotics or acid blockers or an infection, the diet. So these are still things that have a profound impact on the microbiome from age 3 all the way up to about 18, which we consider more adult microbiome. And then when we go from 18 into, let's say around 40 to 50, the microbiome is quite stable. So for example, in my neck of the woods in gastroenterology, we know that the bowel prep that we use to clean out the colon for colonoscopy causes changes in the microbiome. We've seen that in studies, but we also know that in about 2 weeks, the microbiome starts to shift back to something more stable. So we go through a period of stability, microbial stability, from around 18 to somewhere around 40, 50, varies a little bit, those few decades of sort of resiliency and stability of the microbiome. And then what happens? Well, one of two things can happen. There is, again, this sort of period of accelerated change in the microbiome, similar to what we see from birth to age 3, but not quite as fast. And the changes are different. But that is a time, again, so you have fast changes 0 to 3, changes 3 to 18, stability 18 to 40 or 50, and then changes again beyond that. And what we find, and this is really important, is that the microbiome that continues to evolve and become more unique, about 30% of the microbial species are what we call the core species that are shared amongst lots of different individuals. So those would be sort of common to humans. But about 60 to 70% is more unique in the sense that there can be high levels in some, lower levels in others, etc. And so what we find, a key aspect of aging, and this has been true in multiple studies, this is true in a study that came out of the National Institute of Aging last year, it found that we want the microbiome to evolve and diverge as we get older. And this is a little bit counter to what you may think about aging, right? Because when you think about aging, just check, make sure nobody's telling me they can't hear me. Okay, good. When we think about aging, we often think, okay, I'm in my 50s, I want to figure out how I can go back to my 20s and look like I was in my 20s and feel like I was in my 20s. Well, we know that's not possible. But it also turns out that it's not a good idea microbially, because what is happening is your microbiome is adapting and changing and preparing for an older version of you with different requirements. Different things are going on. Our immune system is less active, metabolically, we're less active. And so, it's sort of like what I talked about with the menopause and microbes office hours. You don't necessarily want those high estrogen levels you had as a younger woman when you're older. If you do have them, they can be associated with endometrial cancer and other problems. So, there's a stage and a time for these different stages. And so what the studies have shown, and the big one last year that was sponsored by National Institute of Aging, where they looked at over 9,000 individuals from age 18 to 101. And they found that individuals whose microbiome was showing more diversity, more uniqueness, were aging better. How were they aging better? They had much better mobility. They had much less frailty. And probably most importantly, they were half as likely to die. So the people who had the less unique microbiomes, right, where they weren't showing a lot of evolution and change within the microbiome as they got older, those people had much more frailty, and uniqueness and diversity of the microbiome was inversely proportional to frailty. So in other words, the more unique and diverse your microbiome, the less frail. And the less unique and diverse your microbiome, the more frail. So people who had less diversity, less uniqueness, had more frailty, and they were more than twice as likely to die in older age. So that's pretty significant. And again, they looked at things like mobility, et cetera. So that was looking at the microbiome. In this study, they went a step further, and they analyzed the blood of these individuals who had this sort of more unique, diverse microbiome. And what they found is that they had higher levels of certain metabolites that are associated with longer living and more robustness. And one of them is a tryptophan-derived indole metabolite. And this indole metabolite has also been used in my study and been shown to correlate with robustness, et cetera. And so they had these higher levels of these metabolite that are associated with more vibrancy as we age. They had lower levels of LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. They had higher levels of vitamin D, and again, more of this sort of anti-inflammatory metabolite, if you will. So it wasn't just what was going on a microbial level, they were also seeing things in the patient's blood that were correlating with more robustness, et cetera. So what is orchestrating all of this? Well, let me say that, again, I'm not trying to distill this incredibly complex organ known as the human microbiome into 5 simple rules or anything like that. But there were some other patterns that they were noticed in this study and in other studies. And there's another study looking at aging, frailty in aging. And frailty, as generally defined, is one of the things that is really associated with poor aging. So frailty means you have difficulty getting up from a chair, you have difficulty with mobility, you can't do things for yourself, you're frail. So it's one thing to be old, it's another thing to be frail. And we see younger people who are frail. And let me just make a plug here for my friend Rich Roll's fantastic podcast, the Rich Roll podcast. If you have not listened, you must listen to this episode. It was from a week or two ago with Mike Fremont. Mike Fremont is a centenarian. He's 100 or maybe 101. He holds all these records in the marathon. And I've listened to all of Rich Roll's podcasts, and I've had the privilege of being on the podcast, and I'm going to be on it again soon. And I will tell you that this is my favorite episode, hands down. This guy, Mike Fremont, is busy trying to save the world, dealing with climate change. He's a canoeer. His schedule is that, I believe, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, he runs 5 miles now. He used to run 10 each of those days. And then Monday, Wednesday, Friday, he does his canoeing. And he has a think tank of 4 of them, elderly people, who are meeting on a regular basis to try and figure out how to solve problems of climate change, et cetera. And he credits his diet with a lot of this. He had colon cancer at 70, and he switched to a plant-based macrobiotic diet, which he credits for his incredible athletic performance as well as his longevity. And I mean, there's like a video of him doing pull-up. He's just incredible. And he's so lovely and humble, and is basically like, you got to eat right, you got to move, and you got to have purpose. So that's his version of my dirt, sweat, veg, is his I think, exercise, veg, and purpose. And it is absolutely wonderful, inspiring for all of us who are questioning what is old age going to look like. We should aspire to have the vibrancy of Mike Fremont. So I'll just say that as a plug for that podcast episode. But back to this. So, I talk a lot about my favorite, let me just put this up a little bit. My favorite bacteria, my favorite gut microbe, Faecalibacterium prosnitzii, otherwise known as F. prosnitzii. And F. prosnitzii, as I've told you many times, is the most prevalent bacterium in the guts of vegans who are plant eaters, and even people who don't identify as vegans who are very good plant eaters. And F. prosnitzii is protective against cardiometabolic diseases like diabetes and metabolic syndrome, colon cancer, etc. And it turns out also COVID, in the sense that high levels of F. prosnitzii are associated with a better prognosis after COVID. Well, it turns out, this shouldn't come as a surprise to you, that high levels of F. prosnitzii are also inversely associated with frailty as we age. So you have high levels of F. prosnitzii, you're less likely to be frail. You have low levels of F. prosnitzii, you're more likely to be frail. So let me point out here that for some of these associations, it's not clear what is cause or result, right? Is it the aging process that's resulting in the high levels of F. prosnitzii, or is it the high levels of F. prosnitzii that's influencing the aging? But nonetheless, there is an association, just like we see the same association, high levels of F. prosnitzii, better prognosis after viral infections like COVID, etc., cardiometabolic diseases. So the key to all of this, again, is how do we get us some F. prosnitzii? I think you know the answer to that. When they looked at that study, the 9,000 people, one of the conclusions the researchers made, and of course there are other factors, genetics, hormones, environment, etc., but they found that diet was a pretty key element of this. And they were looking at the diet pretty closely in these folks. And what they found was that a highly processed, more sort of Western diet, so high sugar, high fat, lots of processed foods, was associated with this less unique, less diverse microbiome that was sort of leading to less good aging. And that a high fiber diet that had a lot of unprocessed foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, seeds, was associated with a better aging process, more unique, more diverse microbiome, less frailty, etc. So, no matter how sort of complex and complicated we get into Krebs cycle and, very complex biochemical aspects of the metabolites, we cannot escape from this truism that how we feed our gut microbes matters. It matters a lot in terms of the end result. Not only what we can see in as quickly as 30 hours, as we know from that Nature study, that as quickly as 30 hours of food hitting the gut, we start to see these microbial changes and these genetic changes that are modulated by the microbes. But if we look beyond, so if we take both the short view and the long view, and we say, first of all, do you want to live to 100? I want to live to 100 if I can be like Mike Fremont, running and canoeing and doing my pull-ups. That's a great life. I don't want to live to 100 to be bedbound, in a diaper, having somebody turn me. Definitely not. So it is really, beyond, again, the more maybe cosmetic things, superficial things. And by superficial, I don't mean that they're not important, but I mean the things that are externally in terms of how we look and our hair, and do we have any on our head, and what does our skin look like, etc. But also that inner vibrancy, right, of how we are feeling, and frailty. Can we get up and move around and do things for ourselves? And, I'm in my 50s and I do this now when I'm sitting on the floor. I'm like, I need to be able to get up off the floor without my hands, because I'm an older mother. I had my daughter at 39. So, I might not have grandchildren. I could be in my 70s, maybe 80s, who knows, if I'm lucky enough to have some. And I want to be able to get on the floor and play with my grandchildren. And more importantly, I want to be able to get up off the floor and play with those same grandchildren. So I don't want to be left on the floor as they move to a different area of the house. And so, we really think about these things. And again, it's very hard to escape that a lot of this is influenced by what is going on in your gut and by these basic sort of components of how do you build a healthy microbiome. So what are you feeding your gut microbes? Are you killing them all off with antibiotics and altering the microbiome with proton pump inhibitors? And, what are even things like household products? Are you living inside all the time as opposed to getting out in nature, interacting with nature, getting more colonization with those soil microbes? What does your stress look like? Are you stressed out all the time? That can affect your microbiome. What does your sleep look like? Exercise, all of these things. So these things are important for building a robust and healthy microbiome now, but it turns out even more importantly into the future. So again, before I open this up for questions, and I see we have a few, I want to again point out that we want the microbiome to be changing as we get older, to be adapting and changing. And how do we get a more unique, robust, diverse microbiome? By eating a more robust, diverse diet. That's the way you get it. So again, we go back to the American Gut Project study that I like to talk about from 2018, where they looked at over 10,000 individuals from over 40 countries, and they found this magic number of 30, that 30 or more different plants per week was associated with a more robust microbiome, and 10 or fewer with a much less. So again, it's not enough to just eat some vegetables. You have to think about variety and moving away from, again, the processed, sugary, fatty, starchy food into these, sort of foods from the farm versus a factory, as I like to say, and the variety. And that is probably a big clue to why these older people had this changing, more unique microbiome, because their diet was not static. They were eating likely different things. Okay, so let me take a break here and tend to some questions. What is the name of the podcast I recommended? It's the Rich Roll Podcast. Here, I'll type it. The Rich Roll Podcast. And the guest is Mike Fremont. And Mike Fremont is not a famous guy. He doesn't have a foundation. I don't think he's written books. He was introduced to Rich by a runner. And for those of you who don't know Rich Roll is a writer. His first book was called Finding Ultra. He's a former collegiate swimmer at Stanford. He's actually from this area, from the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, from Maryland. Was a swimmer at Stanford, and his first book, Finding Ultra, is about how he overcame his addiction to alcohol and other substances, and became an ultra endurance athlete, competing in not just triathlons like the Ironman distance, which is swim 2.4 miles, bike 112 miles, run 26.2 miles, but distances twice that. So do the math. That's a lot of swimming, biking, and running, and set all kinds of records. And also in the process, was able to overcome his alcohol and substance abuse addiction and became a vegan, and has this great podcast that's full of wonderful guests. So Susan, I put it up there. Yes, it's Mike Fremont, Lisa, who wanted to know, is the F fiber that is so beneficial to the microbiome available in probiotics, so only created from what vegans eat? How to spell it? So, you're talking about the Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, I think, right? When you say the F prausnitzii, yes. It is not a pill that you take. It is a bacteria in your gut that you cultivate by feeding it the right food. So this is not, let me borrow some F. prausnitzii from my vegan friend or go buy some at the health food store. You're just going to poo that out if you're not, first of all, it's not generally available because this is a very fragile microbe that doesn't live long or really at all in a capsule or powder or anything. So you could buy some F. prausnitzii, but they would almost certainly be dead. So you have to cultivate that. We all have this microbe in our bodies, but to get high levels, you have to eat what the F. prausnitzii need and want, which is fiber, fiber, fiber. And are there different kinds of fiber? Yes. So, there's indigestible fiber, there's soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, there's all kinds of nuances, right? But I would start with the basic. When you think about fiber, less processed, meaning If it didn't come from a factory, better. So apple over applesauce, lentils over lentil chips, brown rice over brown rice pasta. Okay, and think about things like root vegetables. So that would be things like sweet potato, as well as, you know, different categories, cruciferous vegetables like kale, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, brassicas, and of course, beans, legumes are an important source. So what we see is that these microbiota accessible carbohydrates, MACs, are what really feed the healthy bacteria, like the F. brasnitzii. And so food, and not a probiotic pill, which is a live bacteria, or even a prebiotic pill, but actually the food that is all prebiotic, which is primarily the fibrous foods. Okay, where am I typing the info? Oh, maybe I typed it just to the one attendee, so I apologize if I did that, but it is Rich Roll and Mike Fremont, Fremont. Chat was disabled, so we didn't get the podcast name, but hopefully you got it right here. Nicholas says, I went vegan 5 years ago, but have noticed that my skin is really dry. I don't want to take collagen, and I don't blame you because we don't have any evidence that that is going to relieve your skin's dryness. So I was wondering if there's anything I can do microbiome-wise to help. I'm in my late 40s. So Nicola, the reality here with the skin is that there are other reasons to have dry skin, right? And the simplest one would be that you're not hydrating enough. So I always, you know, remind people the rule of thumb is half your body weight in ounces of water. And on that note, let me take a quick sip. Okay, so if you weigh 140 pounds, that would be 70 ounces of water. I'm also drinking some tea here. I don't drink a lot of caffeine, but this is a caffeinated Earl Grey tea with a little almond milk and some honey. And this is a diuretic. So I don't get any credit. This is maybe 16 ounces. Not only do I not get any credit for the 16 ounces of tea, but the caffeine in it can act as a diuretic. So this is actually dehydrating me, this tea, not hydrating me. If it were herbal tea, if it were chamomile tea with just water, different. But just count what you're drinking in terms of plain water, half your body weight in ounces as a baseline, and then you have to go from there. And, you know, there are other things too. There are the lipids in your skin that can also lead to dryness. And so you have to think about the fat in your diet, which depending on what your vegan diet looks like, may be a little bit lower in fat. So you may want to think about adding in more avocado and nuts and things like that to get some of the lipids and some of the healthy fats in. And then you have to think about what you're using on your skin. If you're talking about facial skin, you know, are you using a cleanser or a toner that's pulling a lot of the oil out of the skin and drying your skin? So is this a product that you're using that's drying your skin, a soap or a cleanser or something? And so it's, you know, I wouldn't necessarily draw that straight line between dry skin. There's a problem with the microbiome. And I would think about some of these other things, the humidity in your house. You know, if the air is very dry in your house, that can dry your skin out a lot. So sometimes a humidifier can be helpful. So lots of different things to look into for that dryness. And I hope some of those were helpful. Okay, let's get back to some more questions. Atrantil is not a drug that has been shown to provide, somebody asked, what do I think about that? Not a drug that's been shown to do anything beneficial to your microbiome as far as aging is concerned, or any other diseases that I'm aware of in terms of clinical studies. Okay, what types of fiber do I recommend for constipation and bloating? Well, a little off topic of the microbiome and aging, but I'm happy to help you out with that. Ideally, if you're talking about a fiber supplement, the ones that are typically the most helpful would be psyllium husk for constipation. Some people find that it's a little bloating. You need to drink it with a lot of water. You need to take it earlier in the day so it has a chance to get down to the colon. And if you find that that is not as well tolerated, then acacia fiber, ACACIA, is a more soluble type of fiber that is better tolerated. In terms of foods, we see a wide variety, but I tell you, there was a study done last year, an Australian study, and they looked at prunes and kiwis specifically. And they found that those two foods were actually superior to a lot of the medications that are used for constipation and bloating and were better tolerated. So I'm a huge fan of prunes. Now they can give you gas, so that's something to think about, but most high fiber foods will give you gas because in that process of fermentation by bacteria, there are gases produced, hydrogen and methane, et cetera. And some people, will feel or smell or pass that gas. So it's difficult to eat a high fiber diet and not deal with some gas, but there's also a process where the more fiber you eat and your body gets used to it, you typically have less distress from gas. And so that's something where you might, if you haven't been eating, 8 or 9 grams of fiber and you ramp up to 40 or 50, you might have a lot of sort of gas distress that you feel uncomfortable with. So going more slowly can be a big help. Okay, let's see what else we have. Yes, Allie, I did say 30 servings of different plants per week. And, it's not as much as you think it is when you consider that you're getting credit for herbs, nuts, seeds, all of that. So I like to use the example of oatmeal. I used it last week. You cook a bowl of oatmeal, you get credit for the oats, maybe use almond milk, that's 2. You put in some pumpkin seeds, some walnuts, some raisins, some blueberries. You're already at 6 different plants, okay? You eat a salad with lettuce, tomato, cucumber, we're at 9. You throw in some chickpeas, we're at 10. You have some green beans for dinner, we're at 11. It's not that hard. I mean, you can get up to 15 in a day, different plants, and we're talking about throughout the week. And you don't need huge amounts of them either. So, let's say you add a carrot to that for a snack, we're at 12. It's, and again, like maybe you add a little fermented cabbage, a little sauerkraut as a side, that's 13. And again, you do get credit if you chop up some cilantro or put some mint in a tea, in some tea or something like that. So it's not that hard if you pay attention to it, but you have to be sort of thinking about it and focused on it, right? And if I had to advise you on what is the single most important health tip, and I think about this a lot, what's the most important thing? I mean, you can't do everything, or at least you can't do everything all the time. It's really the variety of plants. So it's eat more plants and eat a wider variety. Don't get stuck in that sort of broccoli, peas, and carrot rut. And go to the farmer's market and look at what they have and figure out what to do with that rutabaga, right? Or those turnip greens, because that is very clear. The variety of plants leads to a more diverse microbiome, which isn't just important for now in terms of short chain fatty acids, healthy immune system, all of that, but it's important for later in terms of how we age. Okay, how many prunes should you eat since they are high in sugar? So obviously get the ones that don't have added sugar. I eat 4 to 6 when I have them. I love them. And I sometimes get the ones with just a lemon zest. And yes, they are, they are relatively high in sugar, but remember that sugar is bound up with fiber. So when you eat a prune, you're not getting that insulin spike that you would get when you have, for example, apple juice, which is just sugar and no fiber. So you're getting sugar with fiber, you're getting slower absorption of the sugar, you're not getting an insulin spike. So 4 to 6 usually is I think a good amount. Okay, I was told I have diverticulosis. So is there a way to have nuts and seeds safely? So I would recommend you go back to the office hours we did on diverticulosis, because it's a little off topic for today. And I address that. So if you go to GutBliss, GUTBLISS.com, go to the office hours page, you see all the archived office hours. You'll see the one on diverticulosis. You can also find it on our YouTube channel. And I go to town about nuts and seeds there. Okay. And I'm glad you love nuts. I do too. And they're fantastic for you. Okay, close to 60, I read hair thinning seems inevitable. I eat salmon and a variety of plants. I take no supplements. Is a simple multivitamin a good safety net? Nutrafol, tempting. Yeah, so Carrie, Nutrafol has great data behind it. And I have many, many, many patients who have taken it, and it can be very helpful. But a few things, and I think if you're going to make an investment in something, I think Nutrafol is a much better investment to make than a simple multivitamin, which is probably not going to do anything. Because Nutrafol has specific ingredients in it that have been associated with hair regrowth. Here's what you need to know. You have to take the full dose, which is 4 big capsules. You have to take it every day, and it will probably take 6, 9, 10 months before you notice a difference. Okay, so it's not that you start taking Nutrafol and 2 weeks later, oh, look, I have all this hair. And what you will find is that you'll have more regrowth, so it's like these the little small, I'm trying to show you, I don't know if it's showing up. Yeah, the regrowth like that of small little hairs on your head like that show that you're having regrowth, but it's not dramatic. And yes, as we, hair thinning is definitely a part of aging. And there is a genetic component to that too. Now, it's not, if your mom had thin hair, you definitely having thin hair. But if you tended to be a family who didn't have like a really thick head of hair, and the relatives are when you were younger, it's hard to anticipate that you're going to grow that as you get older. But slowing down hair loss, and I'll tell you, Carrie, the number one cause of hair loss is not aging. It's what we're doing to our hair. It's coloring our hair, straightening our hair, using heating implements in our hair. Those are the number one. And traction, particularly in African-American women, the number one cause of hair loss is something called traction alopecia, where styles like braids and other styles that are pulling on the hair and leading to a lot of thinning of the hair at the front. So you want to be careful of that. Any hairstyle where you have the hair pulled tightly, whether it's braids, a ponytail, whatever it is. Are you blow drying your hair or using a curling iron on it? Are you coloring your hair? And are you straightening your hair? Those are all things that are going to rapidly lead to hair loss. And so, yes, you want to think about what you can do, like maybe take Nutrafol, but you also want to think about what you can undo. Like, are there those things that you are doing that are potentially contributing to the hair loss? Okay. I'm 67 and was often prescribed antibiotics as a very young child, had a tonsillectomy at age 3. Sounds like my microbiome foundation was affected. Could such a dietary change still rebuild my microbiome enough to make a difference? Absolutely. Absolutely. And to me, this is the really sort of optimistic message about microbial health and gut health is we are in the driver's seat. I mean, can you have a perfect microbiome? No, none of us can. And can you completely overcome some of these things? Who knows? But you can have a good enough microbiome, most of us, through really diligently making these changes. And I'll tell you, the patients who I deal with in my practice are patients who have serious autoimmune diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Some of them may be on this call today. They often aren't. I love seeing their names. I miss seeing their faces. And for many of these patients, I mean, some of the patients we've had to use, big gun drugs too. But for so many of these patients, making these significant dietary changes, increasing the amount of fibrous fruits and vegetables they're eating, has made a tremendous difference in terms of putting serious complex autoimmune diseases like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis into remission or getting symptoms under control. And so I am optimistic, not because of what the science says, but because of what I've seen with my own thousands of patients, and not just what they tell me about how they feel, but when I do the endoscopy and the colonoscopy and I look inside their GI tract and I see inflammation that is healed, is incredible. I mean, it's an incredible feeling to see somebody make those changes and then to see the end results, not with just them telling you I feel better, but to actually look and see areas of deep ulceration that are now healed. So I think, in terms of rebuilding your microbiome, improving it and so on, I think it's incredible what can be done with these basic things. It's not some fantastic magic food. It's the persistence and the consistency of doing these things every day, of making sure you're getting in your fiber, of getting some exposure to soil microbes, of cutting out the processed foods. I mean, not like you're never going to have processed foods, but really limiting that. So really being consistent with those things. So, your history is very similar to my daughter's history of being a C-section baby, minimal nursing, 20 courses of antibiotics before she was 2, before I realized what was going on and how sickly she was as a child. And, not to shamelessly plug my first book, but to shamelessly plug my first book, Gut Bliss. I talk about her study in there, her history in that book, and also in the microbiome solution, and really going through that process with her and having to figure out as a first-time parent that the medical path I was on was not leading to a good place, that this constant antibiotics. I remember when she had fluid in her ears, sort of chronic fluid, and the very lovely pediatric immunologist told me, well, we're just going to put her on antibiotics until it goes away. And I was like, well, how long could that be? She was like, oh, it, could take 6 months. And by then I was starting to realize, okay, this is not a good idea. And the more antibiotics, the sicker she got, et cetera. And so, that was really my trial and error with her of figuring out that this path of nonstop antibiotics is not the right path. And it sounds like you were maybe on a, something similar when you were younger, but, we're evolving all the time. I mean, as we are talking now, our microbiome is changing. And again, we know that we have the power through what we eat, our habits, et cetera, to make those changes, to make those incremental changes. So I think that is absolutely possible. Somebody's saying my mic is off, but can you guys hear me? Can anybody not hear me? Huh. Okay, I'm going to assume that my mic is on and I'm not muted. Another great question. Okay, as I've gotten older, oh, thank you, Carrie, you hear me. Okay, great. As I've gotten older, starting in my 40s, I began to ache as I moved. My doctor had me take a B vitamin and that has helped. What perspective might you have on this? Okay, so again, great question, but so many causes of this, right? So from just inactivity to, on the more benign end to, possibly more worrisome things like types of arthritis. You saw your doctor, which is great, and they had you take a B vitamin. And I don't know whether that's a placebo effect or you were really lacking in B vitamins. I know that B vitamins are fairly benign. And so it's something that doctors will often give people for a lot of non-specific complaints like fatigue or feeling achy or even for weight loss where it's not been proven, because it's one of those things where, well, this isn't going to hurt, maybe it will help. I would have liked your doctor to check your B vitamin levels first, the B12 and the thiamine and the folate. And so I think that would have been my preferred move. But guess what? It's helping. And I assume, you're not taking mega doses where we're worried about vitamin B toxicity. So that's a good start. But I would also, we do, as we get older, start to get achier, right? And we are also typically more sedentary. Like you think about young kids in school and they're running around and they come home and they're jetting around and there's sort of nonstop perpetual motion from they wake up in the morning till they go to bed at night. And we think about, how we live. We're often sitting for longer periods of time, whether at a computer, some sort of screen, et cetera. And so that lower mobility leads to a lot of achiness in the joints, et cetera. And there is some degree of sort of arthritic changes in the joints as we get older. There's an element of that, but by increasing our mobility and doing more stretching and movement and so on, we can also typically decrease that achiness. What's really interesting is in the medical world, when people have osteoarthritis, in the past, rheumatologists and even orthopedic surgeons would often tell them, well, don't do too much because you have the osteoarthritis. Now it's very clear that inactivity leads to worsened arthritis, and that part of the really important treatment for arthritis is movement. But it's a balance, because if you have an arthritic joint, you can't go out and run a marathon necessarily as, the first thing you're going to do. So how do you, first of all, strengthen the muscles around the joint to support the joint? I've been having this discussion with my husband who's been having knee pain. He does a lot of running on the trails and biking. And I said, I think you need to really strengthen your quads and your glutes around the knee. And I knew this because I tore my medial collateral ligament snowboarding a few years ago and had to do a very long rehab, took a couple of years. And they had me doing these one-legged lunges and one-legged squats. And I remember my orthopedic surgeon saying, I want your legs to look like Schwarzenegger. Like, that's how you're going to avoid surgery and build this knee back up, is you have to build up the surrounding muscles. So sometimes that is a problem. Now, I'm just a lowly gastroenterologist. I'm not a rheumatologist or an orthopedic surgeon. So I'm giving you general advice here. And if you feel, I'm glad the B vitamin helped, but try and increase your movement, and also make sure that there's not some arthritis creeping in there with your doctor. Okay. And thank you for the feedback about hearing me. Wonderful. You guys are so kind. Okay. What is my recommendation for probiotics? It's very limited, Diane, because there's very little evidence that for the average healthy person, a probiotic is going to do very much. For some specific circumstances, like I use probiotics for traveler's diarrhea, I use it for inflammatory bowel disease. There are specific circumstances where I use it, but And you know, it can be complementary after antibiotics, etc. But what I want to say to you, Diane, is diet, 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 diet. Okay? Because depending on your diet, you could be taking, I mean, the most potent prescription strength probiotic that I use in my practice is called Vizibium, Visbiome. And I use it in my patients who have serious ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease as a medical food. And there's a lot of data behind that. I don't just recommend that the average person take that. And even for that, if they're not changing their diet, they don't see the same results. So again, when you take a probiotic, you're ingesting live bacteria. But if you are not feeding those bacteria the diet that they need to thrive, you're not going to move the needle. And the diet they need to thrive is that high fiber, you know, indigestible, unprocessed fiber diet. And that diet can often get you where you need to be on its own. Okay. So probiotic plus great diet, maybe some synergy over just great diet alone, maybe in particular circumstances, but certainly probiotic and, you know, average diet is not going to get you where you need to go. So you really need to focus on some of these dietary changes. And it doesn't, you know, let's say, Diane, that you are in the group of you're eating only 10 different plant foods per week, right? So maybe the microbiome not as diverse, not as healthy as it could be. How are you going to get to 30 or more? How about you just add one different plant at every meal? One different plant. So 3 meals a day times 7 days, 21 new plants, 21 plus the 10 you're at 31. So one new plant food a day could be you finish your breakfast and maybe your breakfast is an omelet and maybe you eat a carrot. At lunch, it could be, okay, maybe you're having some kind of sandwich, you throw some lettuce in there. At dinner, it could be, you know, adding some green beans. So really, it is these little things that really add up to make a big difference. And that is what I want you to focus on, not finding out like what's the magic probiotic out there that's going to get you to the finish line, because the magic probiotic that's going to get you to the finish line doesn't really exist, I have to tell you. And if it did, I would tell you about it. And not to say that there are not some things that can be helpful, but to really get to the finish line, Diane, and I see this over and over and over again, because, you know, as a gastroenterologist, I am not just talking to people about their GI symptoms. I am in their GI tract, looking at what's going on. And, you know, again, these products can be helpful, but the dietary change is really key. Okay. Somebody says, I had a partial thyroidectomy over 30 years ago and have never been the same since. Oh, I know, I'm sorry. And that's because your native thyroid gland, what it's doing is it is literally second by second. It is like the, we're the controllers at the airport, air traffic control. Your thyroid gland is like, okay, she's seeming really stressed. All right, more of this. Okay, now she's good. Okay, quiet it down. Okay, this is about to happen. Let's double up the secretion. Okay, now she's over that. Let's lower it down. So it is like air traffic control, figuring out exactly how much of these different thyroid hormones should be excreted and when, based on your state. Are you fasted or fed? Are you resting, in repose? Are you active, etc.? What's going on with cortisol and the adrenal thyroid connection? So it's a very complex, well-orchestrated feedback loops that are going on. And when your thyroid is removed, and I'm glad that it was only partial, but it may have been the majority of the hormone producing part of the thyroid, you're trying to replace that second by second orchestration with just taking a pill once or maybe twice a day. And so it really isn't the same, right? So the question is, how does the thyroid interact with the microbiome, and what can I do to better support both through food? So I'm going to direct you to my friend, Dr. Aviva Romm's wonderful book, The Adrenal Thyroid Revolution. I think that's a great resource for that. It's a little bit of a longer answer than what I have for today's edition of Microbiome Aging, which you strayed a little from, but that's fine. I like all the meanderings. But if you want a more comprehensive look at that, I talked about her great book, Hormone Intelligence, a office hours or two ago, but I think the Adrenal Thyroid Revolution would be a great resource for you for that. And then, of course, you want a good endocrinologist, right, who can look at where you are with your partial thyroidectomy and check your levels and look at, what are the ideal levels for you. But I love the fact that you're interested, okay, not just from a medication point of view, but what can I do in terms of my diet and lifestyle to support my thyroid health? So best of luck to you with that. Okay, James says, I have difficulty swallowing solid foods and sarcoid fatigue, so can't spend hours in the kitchen. Will I benefit from freeze-dried foods such as freeze-dried kale? James, freeze-dried kale is not terrible, but what I would recommend is just doing a quick smoothie with the fresh kale, because the fresh food, particularly the vegetables, is going to be much more microbially rich. So I love a smoothie. I have lots of patients with swallowing problems, whether it is from structural issues like a web in the esophagus, something called a Schottky ring, or eosinophilic esophagitis, which is an autoimmune disease that can cause some difficulty swallowing, or achalasia, whatever it is. Esophageal problems, swallowing problems are very common in my field. And what I find one of the best ways to overcome that is doing a smoothie, but I would do fresh kale for that. And, I love it because I can just blend up a whole bunch of healthy things and suck it down and, without all the preparation and the chopping of and cook or whatever. So that's a great way to do that. And good luck to you with that. Soups are also another great way. And, batch cooking some soups all at one time that you can freeze and then pull out later, like some split pea soup, different kinds of pumpkin soup, things that are really nourishing for your microbiome, but that you can blend that are easy to do. And we do have some great recipes in the Microbiome Solution and Gut Bliss, and on the website on gutbliss.com, we have some great easy recipes. Because I can cook, but I can't spend hours in the kitchen either. I just don't have the temperament for it. So my recipes are all fast. Okay, Carrie wants to know, is it wise to get blood tests for vitamin deficiency, even though eat plant-based is so specific ones? Yeah, Carrie, there are some. B12 would be the main one as plant-based, because that's something we can see B12 deficiency. But, when you go for your physical, if you do that once a year, every other year, however you go, not a bad idea to check iron, vitamin D, B12 would be the main ones. If you have reason to worry about thyroid, then that's fine too. That's not one we would typically check, but we typically check the cholesterol levels, which for you, if you're eating primarily plant-based, should be good. And then B12, because that's the one that plant-based folks can be sometimes low on. And iron, even though there's plenty of iron in plants. And for example, I don't know if you know that 100 calories of romaine lettuce has more iron in it than 100 calories of sirloin steak. That's true. Now, 100 calories of romaine lettuce is a fair amount of romaine, and 100 calories of sirloin steak is a couple bites. But calorie for calorie, which is a real way we should be measuring these foods, the romaine has more iron. So plenty of iron in plants and in beans and stuff like that. But those are some of the ones I would think about. Okay, Rose wants to know, besides a variety of fruits and vegetables, are there specific tests you recommend for the microbiome, or specific teas I recommend for the microbiome, like mushroom tea? Yes, Rose. So I have a post about this on the Gut Bliss blog, and I also talk about it in the Microbiome Solution in my second book, under the section 10 questions to ask if you've been prescribed an antibiotic, and then 10 things to do to take after you've had to take an antibiotic. And the mushroom teas are definitely in there for helping with the microbiome. Okay, taking notes, reading the books, and trying to make changes. Oh, so grateful for your time and willingness. Oh, I'm so pleased to do it. For Vizibium, do I recommend the powder packets or the capsules? Well, the powder packets come in two strengths, 450 billion colony-forming units and 900 billion colony-forming units. And the capsules come in one strength of 112.5 colony-forming units. So it really depends on what the total dose is. For my very sick patients with ulcerative colitis, for example, I may have them on as many as 4 of the double strength packets. But depending on what, and this is why I really recommend doing this with some medical help, right? Because you want somebody who has some expertise in this, where you're not just randomly, oh, I'm just going to try this and see. Somebody who knows, who can guide you and tell you how much they think you need. So it's difficult for me to tell you without really, being your doctor and being in a therapeutic relationship where I know what we're trying to treat. But I will tell you that the main issue is that the capsules are a lower amount of bacteria in them. Okay. I eat a high fiber diet, which causes bloating, abdominal distension, which makes reflux regurgitation worse. Yes, it can. GI doctor said to take psyllium 1 tablespoon twice a day. I like that recommendation, but I have not, as I get bloated after one. I don't know if the T is tablespoon or teaspoon. I have incomplete emptying. Okay, so you're kind of caught in this catch-22, right? Because part of why you're probably having the bloating, the distension, the reflux, the regurg is because you're having incomplete emptying and you're blocked down below. The psyllium will help with that, but only if you can tolerate it. So I might actually do psyllium with a little acacia fiber, which will probably go down easier. And even think about adding a little magnesium at night to help clear out what's down there. And again, this is just from an educational perspective, check with your doctor, but ask your doctor about maybe doing half the dose psyllium, half the dose acacia, ACACIA, and adding a little magnesium at night. Because I think if you can get better emptying down below and really get a good clean out, you're going to have less trouble with the high fiber diet, which I want you to eat and which you want to eat. Okay. Susan B says, is the health and flexibility of ligaments linked to a diverse microbiome, which would help prevent frailty and other issues? I'm curious in particular about the median arcuate ligament associated with mouths. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, Susan. There may be a study looking at ligaments specifically and the microbiome, but I don't know. I'm not aware of that. And it's not something that I've come across. You know, the studies have looked generally at frailty. That would be a very specific study. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm so sorry. And I'm not well-versed in MALS, which is median arcuate ligament syndrome. So not one of the conditions that I treat. I'm so sorry. Is there a way to test your gut microbiome for diversity? Yes, Rose, there is. The American Gut Project, run by Justin Sonnenberg, that's the one I would recommend. Some of the other ones that are commercially out there, not sure that I feel like I can hang my hat on the results. And sometimes the recommendations they make, I think, are a little bit of a leap, right? But most of them, you can still get a sense of the alpha diversity, even if you're not necessarily following all the recommendations. Okay. Do leftovers lose their nutrients? Gina, I love that question. I have to say, I've never thought about that. Cooking in batches. So, you know, cooked food, obviously heat kills bacteria, right? So, you know, you are killing off some of the bacteria when you eat something cooked, but heat doesn't kill nutrients. So from a nutrient point of view, assuming you're not, you know, cooking it to death, you still have some nutrients. And I really recommend for food a mixture, right? Some raw, some steam, broil, sauteed, multiple different preparations. And I think as long as you're not, you know, freezing and eating it next year, I do a lot of batch cooking, but I'm typically eating this stuff within a week or two. I will sometimes go longer. We're heading out on a trip this week, on a long trip. We're heading to Turkey, and I will probably freeze some stuff, cook some stuff this week and freeze it for when we come back, because I think I'll be tired when I get back. But that will be, I think we're gone 10 days. So I try not to get into the, you know, once it's sort of like more than a month, I'm sometimes a little wary, but there's not necessarily a huge scientific basis for that either, right? Except to keep in mind that freezing decreases, it slows down the aging process, but it doesn't stop it. So okay, what caution? So I think leftovers are fine, Gina. What cautions do I need to take if I've had kidney stones in the past, reoxalate so many of the fruits and leafy vegetables? Yeah, so that's something to take up with your nephrologist, your kidney doctor, about oxalate and chocolate and things like that. I feel like the oxalate recommendations in leafy greens, it's a little overdone, in my personal opinion. But again, I'm not a kidney doctor, so I want you to talk to your nephrologist about what level of oxalate they feel like you can tolerate without worrying about oxalate stones. Yes, fennel tea will help with gas and bloating, and much better if you brew it fresh as opposed to a tea bag of fennel. That's not going to do that much. So go to the supermarket, or even better, the farmer's market, get yourself a fennel bulb. You can chop up the whole thing, literally even the kind of little kind of hairy stuff at the top. You can chop up the entire bulb of fennel and brew it, just boil it. When I make it, I do in a big pot, and I will usually do some ginger too and some fresh mint, but just the fennel is fine. And I will boil that, and then I will let it steep for a couple hours and then drain it off into a big glass jar, and then I can heat it up and have it when I want. So fennel, very helpful for that. It helps to stimulate digestive enzymes, etc. Okay. Avid reader, especially health, have all of yours and highly recommend there. Oh, Carrie, you're so sweet. Well, while we're on, well, let me get to these questions and then shameless plug for my new book coming out. Okay, so Nicola, thank you for the skin advice. I just wanted to second what you said about increasing fiber intake gradually. Only I went from a low fiber diet to a super high fiber diet and ended up with microscopic colitis. Not sure that the high fiber diet caused a microscopic colitis, but maybe it caused you to be more aware because you're having more bowel movements. But I don't think we have evidence that a high fiber diet causes microscopic colitis. I didn't link the two things until my gastroenterologist explained that dramatic changes in fat or fiber can trigger it. I'm not sure. Fiber, fat, yes. Non-steroidals, yes. Artificial sweeteners, yes. I'm not sure I've seen a study showing that high fiber can trigger it in terms of causing it, but yes, in the sense that if you had undiagnosed microscopic colitis and then you started eating a lot more fiber and you started having more bowel movements, you could be more aware of the microscopic colitis. So I see a connection, the connection Sheer, he might be trying to make that way. But he still gave you the thumbs up for being vegan. Great, that's wonderful. Stick with him or her. Acacia also causes bloating, but I will try half psyllium and half acacia. Okay, I'm so glad you've learned a lot. Okay, so let me just quickly say, because we are past the hour, that my new book, The Antiviral Gut, is coming out in November 1st. And we're doing the book reveal tomorrow on social media, on Instagram. Check me out there if you don't normally. And this is book number 4 for me. The first book was Gut Bliss, then the Microbiome Solution, then the Bloat Cure, my least favorite, and the Antiviral Gut. And I'll tell you, the Antiviral Gut was a really hard book to write. I signed the contract with my team, the same team I've done for all the books at Penguin Random House, the Avery imprint. I signed that contract around end of January 2021. I had to think about that for a second. And I thought, oh, I'll have this book done by May. And if you guys remember what was going on, and what's still going on to some extent, is things were changing every day. It was literally, there's a new variant, it's up, it's down, things were changing, and the science was moving so fast. So literally every week there was a new article coming out, linking something, microbiome, genes, something. And I said, this just isn't enough time, right? We need to have a longer period of really understanding this viral and this virus and the implications in long COVID before I can really package this up. So a manuscript that should have gotten turned in May 2021 got turned in May 2022. You can imagine how pleased my publishers were about that. But as a result of that, I think it is a far better book. And it was a hard book to write because the book is called The Antiviral Gut, Tackling Pathogens from the Inside Out. And I know about the gut. I've been a gastroenterologist for decades. I've been in, up, down, around the gut. I understand the gut immune connection, but I'm not a virologist. And there was a lot of virology in this book. And I'll tell you, it was fascinating. It was so fascinating reading all the stuff about polio and Cold Spring. And that was the polio foundation that Roosevelt built called Cold Spring, but there's all kinds of backstory, interesting stuff about that place. And I went down some rabbit holes with polio. I was just obsessed. And so it's so interesting now to see, oh, polio in some of the wastewater and some of the sewage in New York and what's going on there, and wild type polio versus vaccine polio. And I'm, fingers and toes crossed, hoping that we're not going to be dealing with that on top of orthopox. But I really wanted to write a book that wasn't just about COVID, and that was in no way designed to scare people, but really to empower people and to say, yes, there are these viruses. And yes, in the last 50 years, we have had 30 new viruses for which we have no cure. This is not the first one. And we're all here, or most of us, and sad that not all of us have survived this, but so many of us are still here and we're going about our lives. And while we need to be informed and we need to be concerned, we don't need to panic. But here are some things that you need to know about what you can do. So, I'm all for modern medicine and vaccines and immunoglobulins and all the other things modern medicine has to offer when we need them. But the foundation for all of that should be, what can we do and how can we build a healthy gut and how can we hone our body's own innate defenses to protect us, and things like fever and mucus and stomach acid and the intestinal barrier and all kinds of really amazing stuff. So it was the hardest book to write by far. It was harder than all three of the others combined, but it felt like a really important book, because while gut health is important, if there's a book I can write about protecting yourself from viruses that can keep people safe and alive, that felt like a really important mission. So it's on sale now, and I hope you buy it, and it will be out on November 1st. And when I come back from my vacation, I'm going to be focusing a lot in the fall on antiviral gut tips, not just to promote the book, but also because you know what happens in the fall, right? We're gearing up typically for another COVID spike. And as Washington, D.C. has the highest incidence of monkeypox in the country, at least it did last week. And so as things start to emerge there, every week we get new guidelines from the hospital about screening, et cetera. So as that starts to pick up steam, and maybe the polio story is something old that's new again, I hope not, but I just want to make sure that people really understand what they can do in addition to all the other wonderful things that modern medicine has to offer. Okay. All right. As usual, it's been great seeing you guys, or being with you.